What does a man do the morning after the worst thing he has ever done? Not in the abstract, not as a theological question, posed at a comfortable distance from the answer. What does he actually do when the morning comes and the ground is still and the field is quiet and his brother is not there and never will be again? What does a man do with his hands on a morning like that? The book of Genesis gives you the judgment. It gives you the exile. It gives you the mark and the land east of Eden, called Nod, which in the ancient Hebrew means restlessness. Genesis gives you all of that. And then, in one sentence, almost without pausing, it gives you something else entirely. Something that stopped me the first time I read it slowly enough to feel what it was saying. He built a city, not a shelter, not a camp, a city. The first city ever raised by human hands on this earth, built by the first murderer who ever lived. And the Ethiopian Bible recorded something about that city that Genesis left entirely out. Something the Cave of Treasures, one of the oldest accounts of the early world, still in existence, preserved in specific detail about why Cain built it, what he placed at its center, and what that city became in the generations that grew up inside its walls. That is where we are going tonight. Not away from the hard thing, into it carefully, because the Ethiopian tradition did not look at Cain's city and see only what went wrong inside it. It looked at the act of building itself and saw something that changes the whole question. Not what did Cain do wrong. What did Cain do with everything he was still carrying when the morning came and the ground was quiet and he was still alive? Stay close, night traveler. What was built on that ground has been waiting a very long time to be properly seen. There are nights when I come to a text, not because I planned to, not because it was next on the list, or because I had set aside time for it, or because someone pointed me toward it, but because something in the way I had been reading around it for weeks made it impossible to keep passing. I am Pastor Michael, and the passage that finally stopped me was not the murder. Everyone stops at the murder. Genesis 4:8 is one of the most recognized verses in the entire sacred record. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. 6 words in the Hebrew. The weight of the entire human story compressed into 6 words, and then the text moves on. What stopped me was the sentence after the exile. The sentence most people read on their way to somewhere else. Genesis 4:17. And he built a city. 4 words. For the first city ever constructed by human hands. No description of its walls. No record of how long it took. No account of who laid the first stone, or what the ground felt like under the hands of the man building it. Just, and he built a city. And then the text moves on again. I have been a pastor long enough to know that when a text moves on quickly from something that large, it is not because the thing was small. It is because the thing was too large for the tradition that received it to know exactly what to do with. So I went looking the way I go looking when Genesis closes a door without explaining why, not to force the door open, just to stand near it with a lamp and see what the light finds at the edges. What I found was the Cave of Treasures, Mirat Gazze, in the ancient Syriac tradition, one of the oldest accounts of the early world that any tradition on earth still holds. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church received this text and kept it not as peripheral commentary, not as historical curiosity, but as living record, as something that belonged next to Genesis, because it answered what Genesis preserved in silence and what the Cave of Treasures records about the city Cain built is not what I expected when I first sat down with it. I expected condemnation. I expected a record of what went wrong inside a city founded by a man under judgment. What I found instead was something far more specific, far more human, a detail about why Cain named the city what he named it, a detail about what the act of naming in the Gäddässä scribal tradition actually means when it is applied to this moment in Genesis, and a detail about what was placed at the city's center when it was first built that the text of Genesis never recorded, but the Cave of Treasures did not let go of. I want to give you that detail tonight, night traveler, not as a lecture, not as a doctrinal point handed across a careful distance, but the way I first received it, sitting with the Gäddässä text in the specific quiet of a night, very much like this one, following the trail, one sentence at a time, not knowing exactly where it leads, only knowing that what built the first city was not only what we were told it was. We begin where Cain begins, east of Eden, in a land called Nod, with his hands, and the morning, and everything he was still carrying when the ground finally stopped crying out long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. And what he did next is the reason we are here tonight. Let us go to the field. Not to the moment of the killing. That moment has been examined, preached over, painted, carried through 2,000 years of theological reflection. We know what happened there. Let us go to the moment after. The field is quiet now, the way fields go quiet when something has happened in them that the ground itself did not expect to receive. Cain is standing in that quiet, alone, the way no human being had ever been alone before that moment, because before that moment, no human being had ever been the only living person who knew. What they had just done, there was no precedent for this. No one had ever stood where Cain was standing. No tradition to reach for. No elder who had survived something similar and could say, here is what you do now. Here is how you carry this. Here is what the morning looks like. On the other side of it, there was only the field and the quiet and the ground that had received what it was never meant to receive. And then the question The Cave of Treasures, which the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has held in its canon alongside Genesis for century after century, records something about this moment that the Western tradition largely set aside. It records what Cain understood when God's question arrived, not the question itself. The question is in Genesis. Where is Abel your brother? What the Cave of Treasures records is what happened inside Cain when he heard it. Not guilt in the ordinary sense. Not the guilt of a man who did not know that what he was doing was wrong. Something more specific than that. Something the Gäddä's scribal tradition recognized as distinct from simple moral failure. The Cave of Treasures says that in the moment God's question landed, Cain understood something he had not understood before he raised his hand. He understood that he was the only one left. Not only the only surviving son, the only person on earth who carried the full weight of what had just been done. To the human story, Adam and Eve had lost a child. That grief is its own magnitude. But Cain had done something that could not be undone. He had ended a line, a direction the human story was supposed to go in, a voice that was supposed to keep speaking. For 900 years, the way Adam's voice kept speaking. For 930, Abel's voice was finished. At Cain's hand, and the Cave of Treasures records that the weight of that understanding was the specific weight Cain carried when he walked east of Eden into the land of Nod. Not just punishment, not just exile. The understanding that he had made himself the man responsible for the first silence in human history. I want to pause here for just a moment, because this is the detail that changes the city. If Cain walked into Nod simply as a man running from judgment, then the city he built is exactly what most people have always assumed it was: a monument to defiance, a structure raised by a man who refused to accept what he deserved. But if Cain walked into Nod carrying the specific weight that the Cave of Treasures describes, the weight of a man who understands that he has made himself responsible for ending something that cannot be restarted, then the city is something else entirely. Then the city is an answer, not to God, not to the judgment, to the silence, to the specific unbearable silence of being the man who ended the voice that was supposed to keep speaking. Now, the word I want to give you here is the Gäddä's word that the Ethiopian scribal tradition uses for the city Cain built. The word is in Gäddässä, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Does not mean simply a settlement, a collection of structures, a place where people gather for practical reasons. Carries two weights. Simultaneously, it means city, and it means watching place. A place from which something is observed. A place built not only for shelter, but for seeing, for keeping watch over something that the builder could not afford to lose sight of. The Ethiopian scribes who copied this word onto the vellum in the stone rooms of the highland tradition understood the weight of this double meaning, because Cain, the man who built the first ear, was a man who had learned in the most devastating way possible. What happens when you stop watching? When you stop keeping sight of the person standing next to you. He had looked away, or perhaps more accurately, he had looked, but not seen. He had been present in the field, and absent from his brother. At the same moment, and what the first city was built to do, according to the weight the Gäddä's word carries, was to create a place where that could not happen again. A watching place, a structure designed around the act of keeping sight of the people inside it, of not losing what could not be lost again. I have sat with that a long time, because it means that the first city ever built was not built in defiance of what had just happened. It was built in response to it, in the specific, atching, human response of a man who understood too late what he had not been watching, and decided that the only thing left to do was build a place where watching was the whole point. The Cave of Treasures is not romantic about this. It does not excuse Cain. It does not soften the murder or suggest that the city somehow balanced the account. But it does something that the Western tradition largely chose not to do. It asks what Cain was trying to do when he built, and the answer it gives is not the answer most people expect from a text about the first murderer. The answer it gives is fatherhood, Genesis 4:17. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. He named it after his son, not after himself, not after his survival, not after the God who had marked him and sent him east after his son. The Cave of Treasures holds this detail as something more than biography. It holds it as intention, as the clearest record available of what Cain believed he was doing when he laid the first stone. He was not building a monument to what he had survived. He was building a future for someone else to live in. A man under judgment who could not make the ground yield, who had been told he would wander, who carried the weight of the first silence in human history, chose to stop and build something permanent and give it entirely to his son. That is the act. The Cave of Treasures does not let us move past quickly. That is the act the Gäddä's word, ear, holds inside it. Every time it is spoken, city and watching place built by a man who finally understood what watching meant after it was too late, to watch over the one he had lost. And so he built a place where his son would always be watched over, where his son's name would be the name of the ground itself, where the city and the child would be inseparable in a way that Cain and Abel never got to be. I think about that. When I read this passage now, I think about how many things human beings have built for exactly that reason. Not to escape the worst thing they did, but to give someone they love a place to stand that the worst thing cannot reach. The city of Enoch is the first record we have of that impulse, and the Ethiopian tradition did not file it under judgment. It filed it under the complicated, aching, very human record of what people do when they are trying to build something that outlasts the worst thing they have carried. But the Cave of Treasures records something else about what Cain built, beyond the name he gave it. Something about what was placed at the city's center when the first stone was laid, and what that placement meant in the Ethiopian scribal tradition for everything the city was supposed to become. That is the next thing, Night Traveler, and it is the detail that finally showed me why the Cave of Treasures did not let this city disappear into a single sentence. Let us build it. Not describe it from a distance. Not summarize what the text says about it and move on. Let us actually build it, stone by stone, name by name, the way Cain built it, in the land east of Eden, in a place the Hebrew calls Nod, which means restlessness, and which the man building was trying with every stone he lifted to turn into something else. The land of Nod was not a wasteland. This is important to understand before the city rises. The text does not describe it as a cursed geography. The curse was on Cain, on the ground as it responded to Cain, on the specific relationship between this man's hands and the soil they pressed themselves into. But the land of Nod itself was simply land east of Eden, far enough from the garden that the memory of it was something you carried rather than something you could see. And Cain arrived in it, carrying everything: the mark, the exile, the weight the Cave of Treasures describes as the understanding of what he had ended. And his wife? Genesis does not name her. The Cave of Treasures does not linger on her either, but she is there. She is present in the land of Nod, in the years before the city rises, and she conceives, and she bears a son, and the son is named Enoch. And everything that happens next happens because of that name. Now, the Cave of Treasures records that Cain did not begin building immediately. This detail matters. He waited. The text is specific about this in a way that Genesis is not. Genesis compresses the timeline, the way Genesis compresses almost everything in the early chapters. A sentence for a decade, a verse for a generation, but the Cave of Treasures slows down here. It records that Cain, in the years before he laid the first stone, was watching his son, watching Enoch grow, watching him learn to walk on the ground of Nod, which did yield to Enoch the way it did not yield to Cain. The curse was specific. It was on Cain's hands, on Cain's labor, on the relationship between this man and this ground. But Enoch was not Cain. And when Cain watched his son press his hands into the earth, and the earth responded, the Cave of Treasures records that something shifted. In what Cain understood, he was capable of building. He could not farm, but he could build something that his son could farm inside of. He could not make the ground yield, but he could build walls that kept the ground safe for the one the ground would yield to, and so he began. The Cave of Treasures describes the building of the city of Enoch not as a sudden act of defiant construction, but as a slow, deliberate, carefully considered project. Cain gathering stone from the land around him. Cain reading the ground for what it would hold and what it would not. Cain learning for the first time a different relationship with the earth beneath him, not farmer to soil, builder to foundation. And in that shift, something opened. The ground that would not yield crops would hold stone. The hands that the curse had turned away from the harvest had not been turned away from everything. I have thought about that more than I expected to. The way a limitation sometimes forces a discovery that would never have been made if the original path had stayed open. Cain could not go back to farming, so he went somewhere the curse had not yet followed him, and what he found there was architecture, the first architecture in human history. Raised by the first man, the earth refused to feed. Now, the Cave of Treasures records something specific about the foundation of the city that I want to give you carefully. Before the walls rose, before the city had a name, before Enoch was old enough to understand that something was being built for him. The Cave of Treasures records that Cain placed something at the center of the ground where the city would stand. Not a stone, not a marker, a declaration spoken aloud into the air of the land of Nod, over the ground he was about to build on. The Cave of Treasures preserves the substance of that declaration, not in exact words, but in its theological weight. And the weight is this: Cain declared over the ground of the city that what would be built here belonged to his son, not to Cain, not to the exile, not to the judgment, but to Enoch. This ground, these walls, this city, this watching place, yours. Now, this is where the Gäddä's scribal tradition gives us something that the Cave of Treasures alone does not fully articulate. The act Cain performed when he named the city after his son is described in the Ethiopian tradition using a very specific word. Not the word for naming, not the word for labeling, or marking, or recording. The word used is the word for consecration, Gäddässä. Gäddässä. In Ge'ez, Gäddässä means to make holy, to set apart, to take something that was ordinary ground, ordinary stone, ordinary air, and declare by a specific act that it is now no longer ordinary, that it belongs to something beyond its own material weight. This is the word the Ethiopian scribal tradition reaches for when it describes what Cain did when he named the city Enoch. He did not label a settlement. He consecrated a future. He took the ground the curse had made hostile to him and declared it holy to his son. And the reason this word matters, the reason the Ethiopian tradition chose Gäddässä over any simpler word for naming, is because Gäddässä is the same word used in the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical tradition for the dedication of a church. When a new church is built in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, and the tabot, the sacred tablets, representing the Ark of the Covenant, are carried into the innermost chamber, the moment of dedication, the moment the building passes from being a structure to being a sanctuary, is called Gäddässä. The building is made holy, set apart, no longer simply stone, but a place that now carries the identity of what was placed inside it. And the Ethiopian scribal tradition understood something in applying this word to Cain's act that I find remarkable. The more I sit with it, it understood that Cain's city was the first attempt in human history at exactly this kind of act, the act of taking cursed ground, broken ground, ground that had received what it was never meant to receive, and declaring it set apart, holy, belonging to something beyond the worst thing done on it, not erasing what happened, declaring that what happens next will be different, will belong to someone who deserves better than what the ground has held. The Ethiopian tradition does not say Cain succeeded him. It does not say the city became what he declared it would be. The generations that followed inside the city of Enoch tell their own story about what a consecration built on an unresolved wound eventually produces. We will come to that. But here, at the foundation, the Ethiopian scribal tradition looked at what Cain did and chose the word it uses for its holiest act, not because Cain was holy, but because the impulse to take broken ground and declare it belonging to the next generation is the impulse behind every act of consecration that has ever been performed on this earth. Every church built on a highland in the stone tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo faith, every tabot carried into every innermost chamber of every rock-hewn sanctuary, every act of Gäddässä performed in the 15 centuries of that tradition's careful keeping carries inside it the shape of what Cain attempted in the land of Nod, taking ground the builder could not redeem for himself and giving it entirely to someone else, saying with stone and name and the specific act of placing something at the center and declaring it set apart. This place is no longer about what I have done. It is about what you will do, what you will build, what you will grow, what you will name. After your own son, when the time comes and the ground yields to you the way it never yielded to me, the city of Enoch, rose out of that declaration, stone by stone, generation by generation, a watching place named after a child by a man who finally understood what it meant to watch over someone. And inside those walls, in the generations that followed, something grew, not what Cain intended, not entirely, but something real, something the Book of One, Enoch, recorded in a detail so specific about what the second generation inside that city invented that I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. That is the next thing. Night Traveler, what the city of Enoch produced in the hands of the people who grew up inside it, and what that production tells us about what happens when a civilization is built on a foundation that was never fully resolved. The city stood not for a season, not for a generation. The city of Enoch stood for long enough to produce something that the world had never seen before. And what it produced is the part of this story that most people who know the name Cain have never been told, because the story most people received ends at the city's founding. Cain built it, named it, and then the line continued into judgment, and the flood came, and everything was erased. That is the version most traditions handed forward. The Ethiopian Bible handed forward something longer, something that asks, before it judges, what was actually happening inside those walls, what the people born there were doing with their hands and their minds, and the specific intelligence that 3 generations of human beings develop when they grow up inside a city, rather than wandering the ground outside one. Let us go inside. The first generation born inside the city of Enoch was a child named Irad, Enoch's son. Cain's grandson? Genesis gives us his name in a single phrase and moves on, but the name itself, in the Hebrew and in the Gäddä's rendering, carries something worth pausing on. Irad, the root of this name, in the Semitic tradition, connects to the concept of a fugitive, of one who runs, of one who is in motion away from something. And the Ethiopian scribal tradition noticed this because Irad, the grandson of the first wanderer, the child of the city, named after his father, carries in his very name the echo of what his grandfather was. Before the city existed, the wandering did not disappear when the walls went up. It went inside them. It became the name of the next generation. I want to hold that for just a moment before we go further, because this is one of the details the Ethiopian tradition preserves, that the Western reading of this genealogy tends to flatten. Irad is not simply a name on a list. In the Gäddä's scribal understanding, Irad is evidence that what a founder carries does not stay with the founder. It moves forward. It finds its way into the next generation, sometimes as a gift, sometimes as a wound, sometimes as both. Wearing the same name, the wandering became the city. The city named the wandering into its next generation. and Irad grew up inside the walls his grandfather built, carrying in his name the motion his grandfather had tried to stop. Now the second generation inside the city of Enoch was Mehujael, Irad's son, Cain's great-grandson. The name Mehujael in the Semitic tradition carries a different weight entirely. It means smitten of God, or in some readings, God gives life. The tension inside that name is remarkable when you sit with it. A name that holds both judgment and gift simultaneously, smitten and yet given life. The Ethiopian scribal tradition reads Mehujael's name as the city's first theological question, spoken not by any prophet, not by any priest, not by any tradition, with centuries of careful refinement behind it, but by parents inside a city, naming a child in the only language they had for what they were trying to understand. Are we judged here, or are we given life? Is what was done before these walls still the defining fact of what happens inside them? Or is the child born here something new, something that the judgment does not reach? That question is in the name Mehujael, carried by a child who did not choose the city, did not choose the grandfather, did not choose the ground the walls were built on, who simply arrived into the name his parents gave him and grew up carrying its tension in every introduction. Every moment someone spoke his name aloud, and he heard in it the question. It was always asking, am I smitten or am I given life? I have wondered whether Mehujael ever asked that question out loud to anyone who had an answer. The text does not tell us. It gives us his name and his son's name and moves on. But the Ethiopian tradition does not move on quite so quickly, because the third generation inside the city of Enoch was Methushael, Mehujael's son, Cain's great-great-grandson, and the name Methushael in the Semitic and Gäddä's traditions means man who is of God, or man who asks of God. The city of Enoch had now produced 3 generations of names that trace an arc. The Ethiopian scribal tradition recognized as deliberate. The wanderer, the one who is smitten and given life, the man who asks of God. 3 generations inside the walls. Cain built as a watching place. And by the 3rd generation, someone inside those walls was asking, not wandering, not simply surviving, asking, pressing the question that the city was founded on, upward, toward something the walls themselves could not answer. Now, this is where the Book of 1 Enoch enters the story of the city in a way that changes what we understand about what was being built inside those walls. 1 Enoch, which the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has carried in its full canon as scripture, while most of the world set it aside after the Council of Laodicea in 363 of the Common Era. 1. Enoch records something about the civilization that developed in the generations inside Cain's city that Genesis does not preserve it records what they made. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, what their hands actually produced. Genesis 4 gives us a compressed record of what Cain's descendants invented. Jabal, who lived in tents and raised livestock. Jubal, who made the harp and the flute. Tubal-Cain, who forged instruments of bronze and iron. 3 inventions, 3 fields of human knowledge that Genesis credits to the line of Cain: animal husbandry, music, metallurgy. The Ethiopian tradition received these 3 records and understood them not as incidental biography, but as civilizational evidence. Evidence of what a city produces when it has been standing long enough for its people to stop surviving and start creating, because survival does not produce music. You do not make a harp when you are still trying to find food. You make a harp when the city has stood long enough that there are people inside it with time and minds and the specific hunger that develops in human beings when their basic needs have been met and something deeper begins asking to be expressed. The city of Enoch produced that. Inside the walls, Cain built for his son on cursed ground in the land of Nod. Human beings made music. For the first time, I find that genuinely remarkable. The first song ever sung in a human city was sung in the city of the first murderer's grandson, not in Eden, not in the line of Seth, not in the tradition that kept the closer connection to the garden, in Cain's city, in the watching place, in the consecrated ground, in the walls built by a man who could not make the earth yield, and so built something the earth could hold, that would yield in ways he never anticipated. Now, the book of 1, Enoch, goes further than Genesis in what it records about this civilization's outpump. And this is where the Ethiopian tradition preserves something that most Western readings of the pre-flood world have not fully connected. 1 Enoch's account of the Watchers, the beings who descended and transmitted knowledge to human beings in the generations before the flood, describes what they taught in very specific terms: metalworking, the cutting of roots, enchantments, the knowledge of the stars, the same fields that Genesis credits to Cain's line and the Ethiopian scribal tradition, sitting with both texts together in the way the Ethiopian canon was always designed to be read, as a whole rather than in fragments. Notices the overlap. The civilization that developed inside the city of Enoch was already moving in the direction the Watchers would later accelerate, not because the Watchers taught Cain's descendants specifically, but because the city had created the conditions for exactly this kind of knowledge to develop. A city produces surplus. Surplus produces specialization. Specialization produces people who spend their entire lives learning one thing deeply enough to discover what is inside it. Jubal did not make a harp the first time he picked up a reed. He made it after generations of people inside the city of Enoch had been listening to sound with enough stillness and enough time to begin understanding what sound could do when it was shaped deliberately. The city Cain built created the conditions for the first human beings to become specialists, artists, craftsmen, metallurgists, musicians, people whose entire identity was organized around a single form of making, and one Enoch understood that this kind of concentrated human knowledge, this kind of deep specialization in the generation before the flood, was part of what made the pre-flood world so specifically dangerous, not because knowledge is dangerous, but because knowledge developed inside a city built on an unresolved wound tends to move in the direction of the wound. Music in the city of Enoch began as something beautiful. By the time Lamech, the fifth generation, opened his mouth inside those walls, the first human poem was not a song of praise. It was a declaration of war. But we are not there yet. We are still in the middle generations, still with Irad, who carried the wandering in his name, with Mehujael, who asked whether judgment or life was the defining word for what happened inside these walls, with Methushael, who pressed the question upward toward something the walls could not answer. 3 generations asking the question the city was founded on in the only ways they knew how to ask it, through names, through music, through metalwork, through the specific hunger of people who grew up inside a watching place and could not stop looking for what they were supposed to be watching for. The Ethiopian tradition holds these 3 generations not as cautionary figures, not as evidence of corruption spreading from a poisoned root, but as people born into a city they did not build, born onto ground they did not choose, carrying names whose weight they did not select and could not set down. People who looked at the walls around them and the sky above them and the ground beneath them and asked, in the only languages available, what are we inside this place? What does the city make of us? What do we make of the city? Those questions never found a clean answer inside the walls of Enoch, and the reason they did not is the reason what comes next in this story is one of the strangest and most preserved speeches in the entire pre-flood record. Lamech, the 5th generation inside the city, the man who finally said out loud what the city had been building toward since the first stone was laid. And what he said, night traveler, is the moment the city's foundation speaks in its own voice for the first and only time before the water came. His name means powerful, or in some readings, the strong one. Lamech, 5th generation inside the city of Enoch, son of Methushael, who asked of God, grandson of Mehujael, who carried the tension of being smitten and given life in the same breath, great-grandson of Irad, who carried the wandering inside the walls, built to stop it. Great-great-grandson of Enoch, the child the city was named for. And great-great-great-grandson of the man who laid the first stone. 5 generations inside the watching place. 5 generations of people born onto consecrated ground, growing up inside walls, built by an act of love, under judgment. And Lamech, the 5th, the strong one, the powerful, is the first one to speak. Not in a name chosen by parents, not in the silent language of metalwork and music, in words, recorded words, preserved words, the first human speech in the entire line of Cain that Genesis thought important enough to write down and hand forward. And what Lamech said is this, Genesis 4:23, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Weaves of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. That is the first recorded speech of a human being, born and raised inside the first city ever built. Not a prayer, not a song of gratitude for the walls that sheltered him, not a dedication to the son who would come after him. A declaration of escalated vengeance spoken to his wives inside the city his ancestor built to give his child a place to belong. I want to sit here for a moment before we go into what the Ethiopian tradition records about this speech, because there is something in the plain surface of this text that deserves to be felt before it is analyzed. Lamech has killed someone. The text does not give us the circumstances in full. Someone wounded him, someone struck him, and Lamech killed them for it, and then he went home. Inside the walls, inside the city of Enoch, inside the watching place, named after the child, Cain wanted to protect, and he called his wives, and he told them what he had done, not in confession, not in grief, not in the specific anguish that Cain felt standing in the field, in the silence after, in declaration, I have killed a man, and if anyone comes for me, they will find not the 7-fold protection God placed on my ancestor, but 77-fold. The city had taken the mark on Cain, the sign placed on him by God as protection, not as permission, and in 5 generations had turned it into a weapon, into a declaration of preemptive vengeance, so total, so absolute, that no wound, however small, would go unanswered inside these walls. The watching place had become something that watched for threats, not for the child, not for the future, not for the thing Cain had tried to protect when he laid the first stone for threats. Now, the Cave of Treasures records something about this moment that I want to give you carefully, because the Cave of Treasures does not read Lamech's speech simply as moral failure. It reads it as a revelation, as the moment the city's foundation finally spoke in its own voice, The Cave of Treasures preserves a theological understanding of what Lamech's speech revealed about what had been building inside the city of Enoch for 5 generations. And the understanding is this: a city built on an unresolved act does not resolve the act. It transmits it, generation by generation, name by name, quietly, invisibly, in the specific way that foundations transmit what they were laid on to everything built above them. Cain's act never went away. It did not disappear behind the walls. It did not dissolve in the consecration. It did not fade in the music or the metalwork or the names that asked of God whether judgment or life was the defining word. It waited, patient, the way foundations are patient. And in the 5th generation, in the mouth of the strongest man, born inside the watching place, it spoke, not as guilt, as permission. Cain had killed and been marked and protected. And Lamech, 5 generations later, standing inside the walls of everything Cain had built, heard that story and understood it as license. If God protected the first one who killed, then Lamech, the powerful one, the strong one, born inside the city that bore the name of the protected line, would not need to wait for God's protection. He would declare his own. 77-fold. The Cave of Treasures holds this as the city's confession. The moment the walls that were built to protect revealed what they had actually been protecting, not the child, not the future, the wound. Now, the Gäddässä scribal tradition gives us something beyond what the Cave of Treasures alone preserves here, and this is the detail that stopped me when I first encountered it. The Ethiopian scribal tradition describes Lamech's speech using a specific term for what kind of speech it is, not simply a boast, not simply a threat, a liturgical inversion. Kala makfal, kala makfal. In Gäddässä, kala means voice or word. Makfal means the opening of something that was sealed, the unsealing, the moment a container gives up what it was holding. Together, kala makfal, in the Ethiopian scribal tradition, means the word that unseals, the speech that opens what had been closed. And the Ethiopian scribes who applied this term to Lamech's words understood something about the structure of human speech that I find deeply precise. The first human speech in the sacred record was meant to be praise. This is the Ethiopian tradition's theological understanding of what the first word spoken by a human being was supposed to sound like. The voice given to Adam in the garden was given for naming and for praise, for the specific act of looking at what was made and finding in the human throat a sound that corresponded to its worth. That was the design. The first city, the first civilization, the first concentrated human community should have produced as its first recorded speech something in that lineage, a word of praise, a prayer, a dedication, something that looked at the walls and the music and the metalwork and the generations of children born inside the watching place, and found a sound that corresponded to their worth. Instead, what the first city produced as its first recorded human speech was Lamech's song, "I have killed a man, I have killed a young man, and I will kill 77 times more anyone who comes for me." The Gäddässä scribal tradition calls this Kala Makfal because it understood that Lamech's speech was an unsealing, not of something new, of something old, something that had been sealed. Inside the foundation, since the first stone was laid, the city had finally given voice to what it was built on, not in defiance, not even in full awareness. Simply, the way foundations speak when they have been holding something long enough that it finds a crack and comes through. Now there is one more layer to what the Ethiopian tradition preserves about this moment, and it comes not from the Cave of Treasures, not from one Enoch, but from a fragmentary source that most people have never connected to the story of Cain's city, the Gäddässä. The Gäddässä is one of the most significant manuscript discoveries in the history of the ancient world, found in the storage chamber of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, Old Cairo. In the late 19th century, the Gäddässä contained hundreds of thousands of manuscript fragments spanning 1,000 years of Jewish textual tradition, preserved not by deliberate archiving, but by the Jewish practice of not destroying any document that might contain the name of God. Everything went into the Gäddässä, sacred and mundane together, prayer and shopping list, scripture and personal letter, and among the fragments recovered and studied by scholars over the past century are references to the pre-flood cities, fragments that describe, in terms consistent with both the Cave of Treasures and the one Enoch tradition, what the cities of the pre-flood world were understood to have become in the generations before the water came, and the Gäddässä fragments use a specific phrase for what those cities had produced that the Ethiopian scribal tradition recognized immediately when scholars began making these fragments available. The phrase is houses of the voice, not houses of God, not houses of prayer, houses of the voice, places where human speech had become the defining spiritual act, not speech directed upward, not speech in the tradition of the first voice given in the garden for naming and for praise, speech directed inward, speech that declared the primacy of the speaker, speech that said, "I have killed, I will kill, 77 times more." The pre-flood cities in the Gäddässä's understanding had become houses of the voice. In Lamech's sense, places where the human word had been unsealed from its original purpose and redirected toward the protection of the one speaking. The Ethiopian scribal tradition reading the Gäddässä fragments alongside the Cave of Treasures, alongside one Enoch, saw in all three the same ark, a city built on love, producing knowledge, producing power, producing a voice that finally said out loud what the foundation had always been holding. And I want to tell you something, night traveler, that I have not been able to move past since I first put these three texts next to each other and read them slowly. Lamech spoke his poem to his wives, not to enemies, not to the city at large, not to God, to the people cloistered to him, inside the walls, in the private rooms of the city his ancestor consecrated to his son's future. The wound did not announce itself in the public square. It announced itself at home, in the intimate space where the watching place was supposed to be most itself, most protective, most careful, most faithful to what it had been built for. And it was in that space that the city's confession finally came, not from the walls, not from the gates, not from the metalwork or the music or the generations of names asking their quiet questions toward the sky, from the mouth of the strongest man born inside it, in the room where the people who loved him most were listening. The Cave of Treasures does not let us look away from that, and neither does the Ethiopian tradition that carried it forward. But this, night traveler, is not where the city's story ends, because the Ethiopian Bible preserved something about what happened when the flood came for this city, something about what was inside the walls when the water arrived, something about what was lost, and something even more specific about what was not, what crossed the water, not a relic, not a stone from the walls, something carried in the hands of the one person in 7 generations of Cain's line that the text chose to keep by name. That is the next thing, and it is the part of this story that I was least prepared for when I first read it. Night traveler, I want to step out of the text for just a moment. If you have ever built something under the weight of the worst thing you carried, a relationship, a family, a life you constructed around something you could not fix, I want you to know that the building was not nothing, even if what you built did not turn out the way you declared it would. When you laid the first stone, the fact that you built toward someone else was not nothing. It was the most human thing you could have done with what you were carrying now. Back to the city, because what the flood did to what Cain built is not the end of what the city meant. The water did not arrive suddenly. This is something the Ethiopian tradition is careful to preserve. The flood was not a surprise to everyone it found. Noah had been building for a long time, long enough that the people around him had seen the ark rising above the plain season after season, and had made their decision about what it meant long enough that the city of Enoch had received the information that something was coming and had chosen, in the way cities choose collectively, without a single voice, making the decision for all of them to stay, to remain inside the walls, to trust the watching place, to do what it was built to do, and the water came anyway. The Cave of Treasures records the flood, not only as judgment, but as erasure, a specific, total, and in certain ways, irreversible erasure. What the water took when it came for the city of Enoch was not only the walls, not only the structures, not only the metalwork and the instruments and the accumulated knowledge of 5 generations of human specialization inside the first city ever built. What the water took was the record. Think about what that means. For a moment, every city keeps records. Not always in writing, not always in a form that survives the city itself. But cities keep records in the specific way that communities of people living in close proximity across multiple generations always keep records in memory, in practice, in the accumulated understanding of how things are done here and why they are done this way and who first did them and what it cost to learn. The city of Enoch had 5 generations of that. 5 generations of people who knew in the specific embodied way that only comes from growing up inside a place what the city was, what it smelled like in the early morning, before the metalworkers had their fires going, what the music sounded like when it came through the walls of the house next to yours. At night, what the ground felt like under your feet in the part of the city nearest the gate, where the stone had been worn smooth by 5 generations of people passing over it on their way in and out of the watching place. All of that went under the water. Every embodied memory, every worn stone, every song that had never been written down, because in the city of Enoch, music lived in the body, not on vellum. Every name that had been spoken aloud inside those walls and never recorded anywhere, that the water could not reach. The Cave of Treasures understands the flood as the end of the first human attempt at civilization, not just the end of a corrupt line, the end of the first experiment. The first time human beings had tried to build something permanent enough to outlast the individual lives inside it, and the water erased the experiment along with everything the experiment had learned. Now, the Ethiopian Synaxarium, the great liturgical calendar of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which records not only saints and commemorations, but specific theological observations on the figures and events of the sacred record, preserves something about Noah in the days after the flood that I have not found preserved with this specificity anywhere else. It records what Noah understood about Cain's city, not in the years before the flood. After, in the specific silence of a world that had been emptied of everything it had been. Before the water came, Noah, standing on new ground, wet ground that had received everything the flood carried, and was now beginning again. And the Ethiopian Synaxarium records that Noah, in those first days on the other side of the water, mourned, not only for the people lost, for the city die. This is a detail that the Western tradition largely did not preserve. The Western reading of Noah tends to emphasize the righteousness of his survival, the correctness of his preservation, the justice of what the flood accomplished. And there is truth in that reading, but the Ethiopian Synaxarium holds something alongside it that feels deeply and specifically human. Noah knew the city. He had lived in a world that contained it. He had heard, perhaps, the music that came out of it. He had known people who had passed through its gates. He had watched it from whatever distance. Righteousness requires from the things it cannot join, but cannot stop seeing. And when the water receded, and the world was new, and clean, and empty, Noah understood something about what had been lost, that the judgment did not make untrue. The first city was gone, the first attempt at permanence, the first consecrated ground, the first watching place, the first walls built by a man trying to give his son a place to belong, was gone. And the Ethiopian Synaxarium records that Noah passed this understanding forward to his sons, not as a warning only, not as the lesson of what happens when a city is built on an unresolved wound, as a memory, as the specific, careful, pastor-like act of making sure that the people who would build the next cities knew what the first one was, knew what it attempted, knew what it produced, knew what it cost, knew what it lost, so that the next city, built on new ground, by hands that had crossed the water and survived, would carry inside it the memory of what the first one was trying to be before it became what it became. Quack. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church holds a specific liturgical observance connected to the memory of what the flood erased, not a celebration of the flood, not a triumphant remembrance of judgment executed, a commemorative mourning, a specific practice of holding in the liturgical calendar the memory of what was lost alongside the memory of what was saved, because the Ethiopian tradition understood something about the theology of the flood that the simple narrative of judgment does not fully contain. What was lost was not only what deserved to be lost, what was lost was also the first human attempt to build something that would outlast the builder. The first consecration, the first Gäddässä, the first time a human being looked at broken ground and declared it set apart for someone they loved. The flood erased the attempt along with its failure, and the Ethiopian tradition thought that was worth mourning, even while understanding why the water had to come. I have sat with that longer than most texts. Ask me to sit because it requires holding two things at the same time that most traditions find it easier to hold separately: the justice of the flood and the loss of the city, both true, both real, both deserving to be held in the same breath by anyone who wants to understand what the Ethiopian tradition actually preserved about the first civilization human hands ever raised. But the flood did not erase everything, because someone was inside the city of Enoch, or near enough to it, in the generation before the water came, to carry something out. Not a stone, not a written record, not a relic placed carefully in a chest and lifted above the waterline. Something the Cave of Treasures is very specific about, and her name, Night Traveler, is the one name in 7 generations of Cain's entire line that the text chose not to let go under the water. The only woman named in the pre-flood genealogy of the first city ever built, and what she carried across the flood is the next thing, the part I was least prepared for when I first read it. Her name appears in one verse, Genesis 4:22, tucked at the end of Lamech's entry, the way something important is sometimes placed where you would least expect to find it. After the metalwork, after the instruments of bronze and iron, after Tubal-Cain and his sister, that is how she is introduced, not by her lineage alone, not by what she made or what she invented or what she said, by her relationship to the man beside her, and her name, Naamah. In the Hebrew tradition, Naamah means pleasant or beautiful, or, in some readings, the one who sings. The Gäddässä rendering in the Ethiopian scribal tradition holds the name with a slightly different weight. In the Gäddässä commentary on this passage, Naamah is understood not only as pleasant, but as the one whose presence made the place around her easier to be in, not a passive beauty, an active one, a quality of being that changed the atmosphere of whatever space she occupied, the kind of person a city does not always recognize as essential until she is gone. Now, the Cave of Treasures does not let Naamah disappear into the footnote that Genesis assigns her. It holds her carefully with the specific attention that the Ethiopian scribal tradition gives to the figures. The Western canon moved past too quickly, and what the Cave of Treasures records about Naamah is not primarily about who she was inside the city of Enoch. It is about what she did when the city's time was ending. The Cave of Treasures preserves a specific account of what Naamah carried in the years before the flood, not in the moment the water came before, in the years when Noah was building and the sky was the same sky it had always been, and the city of Enoch was still standing, still producing, still holding inside its walls the accumulated knowledge of 5 generations of human civilization. The Cave of Treasures records that Naamah understood something was ending, not through prophecy, not through divine revelation handed to her, the way revelation was handed to Noah, through attention, through the specific equality of presence that her name in the Gäddä's tradition describes. She was paying attention to what was around her in the way that people who make a place easier to be in are always paying attention, not to the large movements, not to the political structures, or the theological debates, or the escalating declarations of men like Lamech inside the watching place, to the small things, to what the ground was doing, to what the air felt like in the mornings, to what was being lost quietly in the daily life of the city that no one else seemed to be tracking. And what the Cave of Treasures records that Naamah understood in that attention was that the knowledge inside the city of Enoch was not going to survive what was coming. Not the metalwork, not the music, not the accumulated understanding of how things grew and what the earth yielded when it was tended carefully by hands that knew what they were doing. So she began to carry it, not in writing, not in a chest, or a vessel, or a form designed for preservation, in herself, in the specific, embodied, living form of knowledge that does not require a surface to be written on, because it lives in the hands and the memory and the practiced understanding of a person who has done something enough times to know it from the inside. The Cave of Treasures records that what Naamah carried was the knowledge of cultivation, what the earth yields, what it needs, how to read the ground for what it will hold and what it will not, how to tend what has been planted. Through the seasons that test whether what you put in was worth what the ground gives back. The specific, patient, unhurried knowledge of how to make things grow. The knowledge that Cain himself had been denied. I want to pause there because the Ethiopian tradition is doing something very precise in this detail. Cain, the man whose hands the earth refused, built a city, and inside that city, in the generation of his great-great-grandchildren, a woman grew up who understood what the earth yields when you tend it. With the right knowledge, the curse on Cain's hands did not reach into the hands of the woman. Born 5 generations later, inside the walls, he raised so his son would have a place to stand. What Cain could not do was preserved inside the city he built in the person of the one the text chose to name, and she carried it across the water, intact. Dot. Now, the Gäddä's scribal tradition gives us something beyond the Cave of Treasures account that I find one of the most carefully observed details in the entire Ethiopian reading of the pre-flood record. It is the question the scribes asked about why Naamah's name was preserved when no other woman's name in Cain's entire line was kept. Not Cain's wife, not Enoch's mother, not the wives of Irad, or Mehujael, or Methushael, not even Lamech's wives, who heard the city's confession, spoken directly to them, are given names in the record that survived. Only Naamah and the Gädde's scribal commentary on this preservation is not sentimental. It does not say her name was kept because she was righteous. It does not say her name was kept because she was innocent of what the city had become. It says her name was kept because what she carried made the keeping necessary. The sacred record, the Ethiopian scribal tradition understood, does not preserve names arbitrarily. It preserves names when the person bearing them carried something forward that would otherwise have been lost. Naamah's name is in the text because Naamah is in the text. Because she crossed, and what she carried crossed with her, and the world that was built on the other side of the water needed what she brought. The Gädde's scribal tradition connects this understanding to a broader reading of feminine preservation in the Ethiopian sacred record. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church holds a distinctive theological position on the role of women in the transmission of sacred knowledge across moments of rupture. Eve, who kept the practice of kirabat in the years between Abel's death and Seth's birth, carrying the first morning form that the tradition would later recognize in its own liturgical practice. Mary, who carried what no vessel had ever been asked to carry before, and Naamah, who carried the knowledge of what the earth yields across the one rupture that erased everything else the pre-flood world had produced. The Ethiopian tradition sees these three as part of a single, continuous act of feminine keeping, not passive survival, active preservation. The specific, deliberate, paying attention kind of keeping that does not wait for an institution to authorize it, or a tradition to name it, or a council to decide whether what is being kept belongs in the canon. It simply keeps because it understands that what is not kept is lost, and what is lost cannot be rebuilt from memory alone. Glat, Naamah crossed the water. The cave of treasures records her on the other side, not triumphant, not celebrated, not standing at the prow of the ark, with her arms raised toward the new sky, simply present on new ground, with what she carried still in her hands, still alive, still usable, still able to teach the people around her what the earth yields when you tend it with the right knowledge and enough patience to wait for what you planted to become what it was always going to be. The city of Enoch was gone. The walls were underwater. The gates were underwater. The worn stone at the entrance, where 5 generations of people had passed on their way in and out of the watching place, was underwater, and Naamah was standing on the other side, with the knowledge the city had produced inside its walls in the years before Lamech spoke its confession, and the water came to answer it. She carried the good part, the part that was worth carrying, the part that the city, at its best in its earliest generations before the foundation wound, had fully spoken, had been building toward the knowledge of growth, the patient understanding of what the earth gives back when you tend it with the hands and the attention and the willingness to wait. That cultivation requires. Cain could not make the ground yield. His great-great-granddaughter crossed the water, carrying the knowledge of how to make it yield for everyone who came after. I do not think that is an accident. In the Ethiopian traditions, reading of this text, I think it is the tradition's most careful answer to the question the city of Enoch was always asking, can something good come out of cursed ground? Can a place built on an unresolved wound produce something worth keeping? Can the watching place, built by the man the earth refused to feed, produce someone who knows how to feed the world? Naamah, night traveler, is the Ethiopian tradition's answer. Yes, not always, not without cost, not without the water coming first and taking almost everything. But yes, something good came out of the city Cain built for his son on the ground the curse had made hostile to his hands. It crossed the water in the hands of the woman the text refused to leave unnamed, and what she carried is the reason we can ask tonight what the city of Enoch actually was. Not only the monument to the worst thing a man ever did, not only the house where the wound finally spoke, but the place that produced. Against everything, the foundation suggested something worth carrying forward. That is what we are going to sit with now, before the night takes over and the narration slows and the sea receives what we have been carrying. Through this long account, what the first city means, not only what it was, what it means. For every city built since, for every person who has ever tried to build something on ground that the worst thing they carried had already touched, that is the next thing. And it is where the story earns its rest. We have been inside the city for a long time tonight. We have walked its foundation. We have stood in the field where the building became necessary. We have watched it rise, stone by stone, name by name, generation by generation. We have heard its confession, spoken by the strongest man, born inside it, to the people closest to him. We have watched the water come and take almost everything, and we have followed the one person the text refused to leave unnamed, across the flood to the other side. And now, before the night takes over, and the narration slows, and the sea receives what we have been carrying through this long account, I want to draw the long line, the line that runs from the first stone Cain lifted in the land of Nod, to every stone lifted by human hands in every city built since, because the Ethiopian tradition did not preserve the story of Cain's city as a cautionary tale, filed under judgment and left there. It preserved it as an origin account. The origin account of what human beings do when they are trying to build something that outlasts the worst thing they have done. The Ethiopian Orthodox theological tradition holds a specific understanding of what Cain's city was in the architecture of human history. It calls it the prototype. The prototype, not a prototype of corruption, not a model of what to avoid. A prototype in the architectural sense, the first version of a structure that every subsequent version either repeats or redeems. Every city built since the city of Enoch, the Ethiopian tradition understands as a response to the question Cain's city asked and could not answer, can a place built on an unresolved wound become what it was declared to be when the first stone was laid? Can the consecration, the Gäddässä, the act of declaring broken ground set apart for someone else's future, can it hold? Can it actually hold against the weight of what the foundation was laid on? Cain's city answered that question in the only way a first attempt can answer it. Honestly, it held for 5 generations. It produced music. It produced metalwork. It produced people who asked of God inside its walls, and a woman who carried its best knowledge across the water on the other side of judgment, and then it confessed what it had been built on, and the water came. But the question did not go under the water with the walls. The question crossed with Naamah, and it has been asked in every city built since, in every foundation stone laid by a person who understood that the ground they were building on was not clean ground, not unbroken ground, ground that had already to received something it was not meant to receive. And who built anyway? What now? The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition holds a specific answer to the question Cain's city asked, and the answer is not abstract. It is carved into the rock of a highland plateau in northern Ethiopia, in a place called Lalibela. Lalibela. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela are among the most remarkable structures human hands have ever made. 11 churches, carved, not built, cut downward into the living rock of the Ethiopian highland in the 12th century, under the reign of King Lalibela, who understood himself as building a new Jerusalem on African ground, not assembled from gathered stone, revealed from existing stone. The rock was always there. The church was always inside it. The builders were not constructing something new on top of the ground. They were uncovering something that the ground had always been holding, waiting for hands willing enough and patient enough and faithful enough to find it. The Ethiopian Orthodox theological tradition understands Lalibela in a very specific relationship to Cain's city, not as its opposite, as its answer. Cain built upward. He gathered stone from the ground around him and raised it above the earth that had refused him. The builders of Lalibela went downward. They did not raise walls above the ground. They entered the ground and found what was already there. Cain named his city after his son. King Lalibela named his churches after the places in the sacred geography of Jerusalem: Bet Georgis, Bet Medhain Alam, Bet Mariam, not after himself, not after his bloodline, not after what he had survived, or what he had built, or what he wanted the future to remember about him. After what he believed the ground had always been holding. The Ethiopian tradition reads the churches of Lalibela as the correction of Cain's consecration, both acts of Gäddässä, both acts of declaring ground set apart. But Cain's Gäddässä was directed inward, toward the family, toward the bloodline, toward the protection of the builder's own name in the generation that came after him. Lalibela's Gäddässä was directed outward, upward, toward the name that does not belong to any bloodline, and in the difference between those two directions, the Ethiopian tradition holds the entire arc of what human civilization has been trying to learn since the first stone was lifted in the land of Nod. Not that building is wrong, not that cities are corrupt by nature, because the first one was built by a murderer, but that what the building is named for matters. What the consecration is directed toward matters. Whether the watching place is watching for threats to the builder or for the face of the one. The builder was always supposed to be building toward. And now, night traveler, I want to bring this all the way home because the Ethiopian tradition did not preserve the story of Cain's city only as theology. It preserved it as a mirror held up to every person who has ever tried to build something on ground that the worst thing they carried had already touched every parent who built a life for their children out of the wreckage of a marriage. They broke every person who built a career on the foundation of a failure so total it redefined what they thought they were capable of. Every community that tried to build something new on ground still marked by what was done there before anyone now living made the decision to stay. Every human attempt at permanence made by someone who understood that they were not building from clean ground and built anyway. The Ethiopian tradition looks at all of it and says, this is the shape of what Cain attempted. This is the prototype. You are not the first to lift a stone on ground like this. You are not the first to declare with the act of building that what happened here before you arrived is not the final word on what this ground is capable of holding. You are not the first to name what you are building after someone you love and hope with everything in you that the name holds against the weight of what the foundation was laid on. Cain was the first, and the Ethiopian tradition did not let his attempt go under the water without a record. It kept it the way Naamah kept what the city produced. At its best, the way the Cave of Treasures kept what Genesis moved past too quickly, the way the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept 81 books, while the rest of the world was handed 66, because someone in the long tradition of that careful keeping understood that what is not kept is lost, and what is lost cannot answer the question the next builder will bring to the ground they are standing on. Tonight, you received the answer, not from a sermon, not from a theological argument constructed at a careful distance from the weight of what it is describing, from the city itself, from the stone Cain lifted, from the name he gave it, from the generations who grew up inside it and asked their questions toward the sky, from the confession that came through the walls in the voice of the strongest man born inside them, from the water that came and took almost everything, and from the woman who crossed carrying what was worth carrying in her hands to the other side. That is the story of the first city ever built by human hands. That is what the Ethiopian Bible kept when the rest of the world moved past it in a single sentence. And tonight, night traveler, it is yours, not as a burden, not as a lesson that requires something of you, before you are allowed to set it down as the thing that was kept on your behalf for exactly this hour, for exactly this weight you came in carrying tonight. Whatever city you are building, on whatever ground you are standing on, you are not the first to stand there, and the ground has held before. Even when the foundation was not clean, even when the wound was still in it, even then, night traveler, it held, and the morning that came after found someone standing on the other side with something worth carrying still in their hands. That is enough to rest on. That has always been enough to rest on. Before we continue, night traveler, what comes next in this night is different from what came before it. The story has been told. The city has spoken everything it was built to say. And what comes now is not more teaching, not more manuscript detail, not more of the careful, specific, researched work of sitting with ancient texts and handing you what they preserved. What comes now is the sea, open water, moonlight, the slow tide that has been receiving everything the shore could not hold since before the first city was ever built. And if this kind of night, this kind of rest, this kind of ancient story, told slowly in the quiet, belongs in your nights, a quiet subscribe keeps this path open for tomorrow night. And the night after that, and every night, you come back carrying something that needs a place to set it down. One question before the sea opens. What did you carry today that feels heavy? Right now, you do not have to answer out loud. Just know what it is, name it quietly to yourself, because in a moment, night traveler, the water is going to receive it. That is what it has always been for. Stay close now. The tide is already moving.